Chapter 5 20 Red Nails. Two warriors lounged in the guard-room on the floor known as the Tier of the Eagle. Their attitude was casual, though habitually alert. An attack on the great bronze door from without was always a possibility, but for many years no such assault had been attempted on either side. "The strangers are strong allies," said one. "Olmec will move against the enemy tomorrow, I believe." He spoke as a soldier in a war might have spoken. In the miniature world of Zuccottl, each handful of feudists was an army, and the empty halls between the castles was the country over which they campaigned. The other meditated for a space. "Suppose with their aid we destroy Xotalanc," he said. "What then, Zatmac?" "Why," returned Zatmac, "we will drive red nails for them all. The captives we will burn and flay and quarter." "But afterward," pursued the other, "after we have slain them all, will it not seem strange to have no foe to fight? All my life I have fought and hated the Xotalancas. With the feud ended, what is left?" Zatmac shrugged his shoulders. His thoughts had never gone beyond the destruction of their foes. They could not go beyond that. Suddenly, both men stiffened at a noise outside the door. "To the door, Zatmac!" hissed the last speaker. "I shall look through the eye." Zatmac, sword in hand, leaned against the bronze door, straining his ear to hear through the metal. His mate looked into the mirror. He started convulsively. Men were clustered thickly outside the door. Grim, dark-faced men with swords gripped in their teeth, and their fingers thrust into their ears. One, who wore a feathered headdress, had a set of pipes which he set to his lips, and even as the Tecuhltli started to shout a warning, the pipes began to skirl. The cry died in the guard's throat as the thin, weird piping penetrated the metal door and smote on his ears. Zatmac leaned frozen against the door, as if paralyzed in that position. His face was that of a wooden image, his expression one of horrified listening. The other guard, farther removed from the source of the sound, yet sensed the horror of what was taking place, the grisly threat that lay in the demonic fifing. He felt the weird strains plucking like unseen fingers at the tissues of his brain, filling him with alien emotions and impulses of madness. But with a soul-tearing effort he broke the spell and shrieked a warning in a voice he did not recognize as his own. But even as he cried out, the music changed to an unbearable shrilling that was like a knife in his eardrums. Zatmac screamed in sudden agony, and all the sanity went out of his face like a flame blown out in a wind. Like a madman he ripped loose the chain, tore open the door, and rushed out into the hall, sword lifted before his mate could stop him. A dozen blades struck him down, and over his mangled body the Xotalancas surged into the guard-room with a long-drawn, blood-mad yell that sent the unwanted echoes reverberating. His brain reeling from the shock of it all, the remaining guard leaped to meet them with goring spear. The horror of the sorcery he had just witnessed was submerged in the stunning realization that the enemy were in Tecuhltli, and as his spearhead ripped through a dark-skinned belly he knew no more, for a swinging sword crushed his skull, even as wild-eyed warriors came pouring in from the chambers behind the guard-room. It was the yelling of men and the clanging of steel that brought Conan bounding from his couch, wide awake and broadsword in hand. In an instant he had reached the door and flung it open, and was glaring out into the corridor just as Tecuhltli rushed up it, eyes blazing madly. "The Xotalancas!" he screamed in a voice hardly human. "They are within the door!" Conan ran down the corridor, even as Valeria emerged from her chamber. "What the devil is it?" she called. "Tecuhltli says the Xotalancas are in," he answered hurriedly. "That racket sounds like it." With the Tecuhltli on their heels they burst into the throne-room and were confronted by a scene beyond the most frantic dream of blood and fury. 20 men and women, their black hair streaming, and the white skulls gleaming on their breasts, were locked in combat with the people of Tecuhltli. The women on both sides fought as madly as the men, and already the room and the hall beyond were strewn with corpses. Olmec, naked but for a breech-clout, was fighting before his throne, and as the adventurers entered, Taskela ran from an inner chamber with a sword in her hand. Zatmak and his mate were dead, so there was none to tell the Tecuhltli how their foes had found their way into their citadel. Nor was there any to say what had prompted that mad attempt. But the losses of the Xotalankas had been greater, their position more desperate than the Tecuhltli had known. The maiming of their scaly ally, the destruction of the burning skull, and the news gasped by a dying man that mysterious white-skinned allies had joined their enemies, had driven them to the frenzy of desperation and the wild determination to die dealing death to their ancient foes. The Tecuhltli, recovering from the first stunning shock of the surprise that had swept them back into the throne room and littered the floor with their corpses, fought back with an equally desperate fury, while the door guards from the lower floors came racing to hurl themselves into the fray. It was a death fight of rabid wolves, blind, panting, merciless. Back and forth it surged, from door to dais, blades whickering and striking into flesh, blood spurting, feet stamping the crimson floor where redder pools were forming. Ivory tables crashed over, seats were splintered, velvet hangings torn down were stained red. It was the bloody climax of a bloody half-century, and every man there sensed it. But the conclusion was inevitable. The Tecuhltli outnumbered the invaders almost 2-1, and they were heartened by that fact, and by the entrance into the melee of their light-skinned allies. These crashed into the fray with the devastating effect of a hurricane plowing through a grove of saplings. In sheer strength, no 3 Tlazitlans were a match for Conan, and in spite of his weight he was quicker on his feet than any of them. He moved through the whirling, eddying mass with the surety and destructiveness of a grey wolf amidst a pack of alley curs, and he strode over a wake of crumpled figures. Valeria fought beside him, her lips smiling and her eyes blazing. She was stronger than the average man, and far quicker and more ferocious. Her sword was like a living thing in her hand. Where Conan beat down the opposition by the sheer weight and power of his blows, breaking spears, splitting skulls, and cleaving bosoms to the breastbone, Valeria brought into action a finesse of sword-play that dazzled and bewildered her antagonists before it slew them. Again and again a warrior, heaving high his heavy blade, found her point in his jugular before he could strike. Conan, towering above the field, strode through the welter, smiting right and left, but Valeria moved like an elusive phantom, constantly shifting, and thrusting, and slashing as she shifted. Swords missed her again and again, as the wielders flailed the empty air and died with her point in their hearts or throats, and her mocking laughter in their ears. Neither sex nor condition was considered by the maddened combatants. The 5 women of the Xotalankas were down with their throats cut before Conan and Valeria entered the fray, and when a man or woman went down under the stamping feet, there was always a knife ready for the helpless throat, or a sandaled foot eager to crush the prostrate skull. From wall to wall, from door to door, rolled the waves of combat, spilling over into adjoining chambers, and presently only Tecuhltli and their white-skinned allies stood upright in the great throne-room. The survivors stared bleakly and blankly at each other, like survivors after Judgment Day or the destruction of the world. On legs wide-braced, hands gripping notched and dripping swords, blood trickling down their arms, they stared at one another across the mangled corpses of friends and foes. They had no breath left to shout, but a bestial mad howling rose from their lips. It was not a human cry of triumph. It was the howling of a rabid wolf pack stalking among the bodies of its victims. Conan caught Valeria's arm and turned her about. "You've got a stab in the calf of your leg," he growled. She glanced down, for the first time aware of a stinging in the muscles of her leg. Some dying man on the floor had fleshed his dagger with his last effort. "You look like a butcher yourself," she laughed. He shook a red shower from his hands. "Not mine. Oh, a scratch here and there. Nothing to bother about. But that calf ought to be bandaged." Olmec came through the litter, looking like a ghoul with his naked massive shoulders splashed with blood, and his black beard dabbled in crimson. His eyes were red, like the reflection of flame on black water. "We have won," he croaked dazedly. "The feud is ended. The dogs of Xotalanc lie dead. Oh, for a captive to flay alive! Yet it is good to look upon their dead faces. 20 dead dogs. 20 red nails for the black column." "You'd best see to your wounded," grunted Conan, turning away from him. "Here, girl, let me see that leg." "Wait a minute." She shook him off impatiently. The fire of fighting still burned brightly in her soul. "How do we know these are all of them? These might have come on a raid of their own." "They would not split the clan on a foray like this," said Olmec, shaking his head, and regaining some of his ordinary intelligence. Without his purple robe the man seemed less like a prince than some repellent beast of prey. "I will stake my head upon it that we have slain them all. There were less of them than I dreamed, and they must have been desperate. But how came they into Cotley?" "The pipes of madness," she said. "A warrior tells me that Zatmak opened the door to the Xotalancas, and was cut down as they stormed into the guard-room. This warrior came to the guard-room from the inner hall just in time to see it happen, and to hear the last of a weird strain of music which froze his very soul. Tolkemec used to talk of these pipes, which the Zucotlans swore were hidden somewhere in the catacombs with the bones of the ancient wizard who used them in his lifetime. Somehow the dogs of Xotalanc found them and learned their secret." "Somebody ought to go to Xotalanc and see if any remain alive," said Conan. "I'll go if somebody will guide me." Olmec glanced at the remnants of his people. There were only 20 left alive, and of these several lay groaning on the floor. Taskela was the only one of the Tecuhltli who had escaped without a wound. The princess was untouched, though she had fought as savagely as any. "Who will go with Conan to Xotalanc?" asked Olmec. Tecotl limped forward. The wound on his thigh had started bleeding afresh, and he had another gash across his ribs. "I will go." "No, you won't," vetoed Conan. "And you're not going either, Valeria. In a little while that leg will be getting stiff." "I will go," volunteered a warrior who was knotting a bandage about a slashed forearm. "Very well, Yaneth. Go with the Cimmerian. And you too, Topal." Olmec indicated another man whose injuries were slight. "But first aid to lift the badly wounded on these couches, where we may bandage their hurts." This was done quickly. As they stooped to pick up a woman who had been stunned by a war club, Olmec's beard brushed Topal's ear. Conan thought the prince muttered something to the warrior, but he could not be sure. A few moments later he was leading his companions down the hall. Conan glanced back as he went out the door, at that shambles where the dead lay on the smoldering floor. Blood-stained dark limbs nodded in attitudes of fierce muscular effort. Dark faces frozen in masks of hate. Glassy eyes glaring up at the green fire jewels which bathed the ghastly scene in a dusky emerald witchlight. Among the dead the living moved aimlessly, like people moving in a trance. Conan heard Olmec call a woman and direct her to bandage Valeria's leg. The pirate followed the woman into an adjoining chamber, already beginning to limp slightly. Warily the two Tecuhltli led Conan along the hall beyond the bronze door, and through chamber after chamber shimmering in the green fire. They saw no one, heard no sound. After they crossed the great hall which bisected the city from north to south, their caution was increased by the realization of their nearness to enemy territory. But chambers and halls lay empty to their wary gaze, and they came at last along a broad, dim hallway and halted before a bronze door similar to the eagle door of Tecuhltli. Gingerly they tried it, and it opened silently under their fingers. Awed, they started into the green-lit chambers beyond. For 50 years no Tecuhltli had entered those halls, save as a prisoner going to a hideous doom. To go to Xotalanc had been the ultimate horror that could befall a man of the western castle. The terror of it had stalked through their dreams since earliest childhood. To Yaneth and Topal, the bronze door was like the portal of hell. They cringed back, unreasoning horror in their eyes, and Conan pushed past them and strode into Xotalanc. Timidly they followed him. As each man set foot over the threshold, he stared and glared wildly about him, but only their quick, hurried breathing disturbed the silence. They had come into a square guard-room, like that behind the eagle door of Tecuhltli, and, similarly, a hall ran away from it to a broad chamber that was a counterpart of Olmec's throne-room. Conan glanced down the hall with its rugs and divans and hangings, and stood listening intently. He heard no noise, and the rooms had an empty feel. He did not believe there were any Xotalancas left alive in Zucotl. "Come on," he muttered, and started down the hall. He had not gone far when he was aware that only Yaneth was following him. He wheeled back to see Topal standing in an attitude of horror, one arm out as if to fend off some threatening peril, his distended eyes fixed with hypnotic intensity on something protruding from behind a divan. "What the devil?" Then Conan saw what Topal was staring at, and he felt a faint twitching of the skin between his giant shoulders. A monstrous head protruded from behind the divan, a reptilian head, broad as the head of a crocodile, with down-curving fangs that projected over the lower jaw. But there was an unnatural limpness about the thing, and the hideous eyes were glazed. Conan peered behind the couch. It was a great serpent which lay there limp in death, but such a serpent as he had never seen in his wanderings. The reek and chill of the deep black earth were about it, and its color was an indeterminable hue which changed with each new angle from which he surveyed it. A great wound in the neck showed what had caused its death. "It is the crawler," whispered Yaneth. "It's the thing I slashed on the stair," grunted Conan. "After it trailed us to the eagle door, it dragged itself here to die. How could the Xotalancas control such a brute?" The Tecuhltli shivered and shook their heads. "They brought it up from the black tunnels below the catacombs. They discovered secrets unknown to Tecuhltli." "Well, it's dead, and if they'd had any more of them, they'd have brought them along when they came to Tecuhltli. Come on." They crowded close at his heels as he strode down the hall and thrust on the silver-worked door at the other end. "If we don't find anybody on this floor," he said, "we'll descend into the lower floors. We'll explore Xotalanc from the roof to the catacombs. If Xotalanc is like Tecuhltli, all the rooms and halls in this tier will be lighted. What the devil?" They had come into the broad throne chamber, so similar to that one in Tecuhltli. There were the same jade dais and ivory seat, the same divans, rugs, and hangings on the walls. No black, red-scarred columns stood behind the throne dais, but evidence of the grim feud were not lacking. Ranged along the wall behind the dais were rows of glass-covered shelves, and on those shelves hundreds of human heads, perfectly preserved, stared at the startled watchers with emotionless eyes, as they had stared for only the gods knew how many months and years. Topal muttered a curse, but Yaneth stood silent, the mad light growing in his wide eyes. Conan frowned, knowing that Tlazitlan's sanity was hung on a hair trigger. Suddenly Yaneth pointed to the ghastly relics with a twitching finger. "There is my brother's head," he murmured. "And there is my father's younger brother. And there, beyond them, is my sister's eldest son." Suddenly he began to weep, dry-eyed, with harsh, loud sobs that shook his frame. He did not take his eyes from the heads. His sobs grew shriller, changed to frightful, high-pitched laughter, and that in turn became an unbearable screaming. Yaneth was stark mad. Conan laid a hand on his shoulder, and as if the touch had released all the frenzy in his soul, Yaneth screamed and whirled, striking at the Cimmerian with his sword. Conan parried the blow, and Topal tried to catch Yaneth's arm. But the madman avoided him, and with froth flying from his lips, he drove his sword deep into Topal's body. Topal sank down with a groan, and Yaneth whirled for an instant like a crazy dervish, and he ran at the shelves and began hacking at the glass with his sword, screeching blasphemously. Conan sprang at him from behind, trying to catch him unaware and disarm him, but the madman wheeled and lunged at him, screaming like a lost soul. Realizing that the warrior was hopelessly insane, the Cimmerian sidestepped, and as the maniac went past, he swung a cut that severed the shoulder bone and breast, and dropped the man dead beside his dying victim. Conan bent over Topal, seeing that the man was at his last gasp. It was useless to seek to stanch the blood gushing from the horrible wound. "You're done for, Topal," grunted Conan. "Any word you want to send to your people?" "Bend closer," gasped Topal, and Conan complied, and an instant later caught the man's wrist as Topal struck at his breast with a dagger. "Crom!" swore Conan. "Are you mad too?" "Olmec ordered it," gasped the dying man. "I know not why. As we lifted the wounded upon the couches, he whispered to me, bidding me to slay you as we returned to Tecuhltli." And with the name of his clan on his lips, Topal died. Conan scowled down at him in puzzlement. This whole affair had an aspect of lunacy. Was Olmec mad too? Were all the Tecuhltli madder than he had realized? With a shrug of his shoulders he strode down the hall and out of the bronze door, leaving the dead Tecuhltli lying before the staring eyes of their kinsmen's heads. Conan needed no guide back through the labyrinth they had traversed. His primitive instinct of direction led him unerringly along the route they had come. He traversed it as warily as he had before, his sword in his hand, and his eyes fiercely searching each shadowed nook and corner, for it was his former allies he feared now, not the ghosts of the slain Xotalancas. He had crossed the great hall and entered the chambers beyond, when he heard something moving ahead of him, something which gasped and panted, and moved with a strange floundering, scrambling noise. A moment later Conan saw a man crawling over the flaming floor toward him, a man whose progress left a broad, bloody smear on the smoldering surface. It was Tecuhltli, and his eyes were already glazing. From a deep gash in his breast blood gushed steadily between the fingers of his clutching hand. With the other he clawed and hitched himself along. "Conan!" he cried chokingly. "Conan! Olmec has taken the yellow-haired woman!" "So that's why he told Topal to kill me," murmured Conan, dropping to his knee beside the man, who his experienced eye told him was dying. "Olmec isn't as mad as I thought." Tecuhltli's groping fingers plucked at Conan's arm. In the cold, loveless, and altogether hideous life of the Tecuhltli, his admiration and affection for the invaders from the outer world formed a warm human oasis, constituted a tie that connected him with a more natural humanity that was totally lacking in his fellows, whose only emotions were hate, lust, and the urge of sadistic cruelty. "I sought to oppose him," gurgled Tecuhltli, blood bubbling frothily to his lips. "But he struck me down. He thought he had slain me, but I crawled away. Ah, Set, how far I have crawled in my own blood! Beware, Conan! Olmec may have set an ambush for your return. Slay Olmec. He is a beast. Take Valeria and flee. Fear not to traverse the forest. Olmec and Tascala lied about the dragons. They slew each other years ago, all save the strongest. For a dozen years there has been only one dragon. If you have slain him, there is naught in the forest to harm you. He was the god Olmec worshipped, and Olmec fed human sacrifices to him, the very old and the very young, bound and hurled from the wall. Hasten! Olmec has taken Valeria to the chamber of the... His head slumped down, and he was dead before it came to rest on the floor. Conan sprang up, his eyes like live coals. So that was Olmec's game, having first used the strangers to destroy his foes. He should have known that something of the sort would be going on in that black-bearded degenerate's mind. The Cimmerian started toward Tecuhltli with reckless speed. Rapidly he reckoned the numbers of his former allies. Only 21, counting Olmec, had survived that fiendish battle in the throne room. 3 had died since, which left 17 enemies with which to reckon. In his rage, Conan felt capable of accounting for the whole clan single-handed. But the innate craft of the wilderness rose to guide his berserk rage. He remembered Tecuhltli's warning of an ambush. It was quite probable that the prince would make such provisions, on the chance that Topal might have failed to carry out his order. Olmec would be expecting him to return by the same route he had followed in going to Xotalanc. Conan glanced up at a skylight under which he was passing, and caught the blurred glimmer of stars. They had not yet begun to pale for dawn. The events of the night had been crowded into a comparatively short space of time. He turned aside from his direct course and descended a winding staircase to the floor below. He did not know where the door was to be found that led into the castle on that level, but he knew he could find it. How he was to force the locks he did not know. He believed that the doors of Tecuhltli would all be locked and bolted, if for no other reason than the habits of half a century. But there was nothing else but to attempt it. Sword in hand, he hurried noiselessly on through a maze of green-lit or shadowy rooms and halls. He knew he must be near Tecuhltli, when a sound brought him up short. He recognized it for what it was, a human being trying to cry out through a stifling gag. It came from somewhere ahead of him and to the left. In those deathly still chambers a small sound carried a long way. Conan turned aside and went seeking after the sound, which continued to be repeated. Presently he was glaring through a doorway upon a weird scene. In the room into which he was looking, a low, rack-like frame of iron lay on the floor, and a giant figure was bound prostrate upon it. His head rested on a bed of iron spikes which were already crimson-pointed with blood where they had pierced his scalp. A peculiar harness-like contrivance was fastened about his head, though in such a manner that the leather band did not protect his scalp from the spikes. This harness was connected by a slender chain to the mechanism that upheld a huge iron ball which was suspended above the captive's hairy breast. As long as the man could force himself to remain motionless, the iron ball hung in its place. But when the pain of the iron points caused him to lift his head, the ball lurched downward a few inches. Presently his aching neck muscles would no longer support his head in its unnatural position, and it would fall back on the spikes again. It was obvious that eventually the ball would crush him to a pulp, slowly and inexorably. The victim was gagged, and above the gag his great black ox eyes rolled wildly toward the man in the doorway, who stood in silent amazement. The man on the rack was Olmec, Prince of Tekotli.